Hello, everybody. It's week 5, and here I am speaking to you today from my beautiful, if somewhat sparsely furnished office in the Honours College here on UB's North Campus. So, how are you all? Today we're going to talk about race, ethnicity, the idea of Orientalism, and how these issues of identity and racial identity impact upon our ways of reading. Now, this of course is an issue that spills out into a much wider arena just than simple questions of literary criticism, and it's one that really is as relevant now as it has been for centuries, really. With the election of Barack Obama to President of the United States, there has been some suggestion that we're living in a kind of post-racial moment, which is to say that we have sort of transcended the issues of race and ethnicity that we struggled with during the civil rights era and obviously prior to that in the age of slavery and emancipation. However, some simple statistics offered by the Departments of Education or the Census Bureau show us that minorities, especially African Americans, suffer or have to deal with structural inequalities that mean that they are not that they do not have the access to opportunity that white people do have. So, for example, African American men are 3 times more likely to be searched when stopped by the police than white people. They're 3 times more likely to be handcuffed by the police. They're 3 times more likely to be arrested by the police, and they're 6.5 times more likely to be incarcerated than white men. The rate of poverty among all the races is 11.7%, but among African Americans it's 28.1%, so it's over double. The high school dropout rate for white kids is 5%. For African Americans, it's 8%. Now, of course, African Americans constitute a much smaller demographic of the population, yet they disproportionately suffer from many of these inequalities and social problems. Now, of course, we've known this for a long time, and since the 70s there have been enormous steps made in sort of progressive social justice and racial equality, and the fact that Barack Obama could even be a candidate for president, I think is evidence of things going in the right direction. And it's my hope, and I'm sure it's one shared by all of you, that one day we will live in a post-racial world and these issues won't affect us. But as literary critics, especially literary critics who are trying to develop a kind of historical consciousness and a sense of how history, a sort of long view of history plays out into the present and manifests itself in the present in many of our sort of preconceptions and ways of thinking about things, then I think we need to pay very close attention to how the politics of race have come to the point they have come to. Now, white Europeans have a long history of interaction with people of other races from around the world through their global enterprises, through colonialism, through international trade, imperialism, and the establishment of empire. Obviously, as a British citizen, I know a great deal about the history of British imperialism and also its impact on the present day. So the school I went to in South London, around 35% of the students there had Urdu as their first language. They were what in America you'd call South Asians, especially from Pakistan, Kashmir, Bangladesh, places like that. And of course, they were in Britain and they were in my school because many of them were first-generation immigrants. They'd literally just arrived in the last couple of years, very much English learners, and they were there because for them Britain was the mother country, right? They were leaving behind the kind of poverty and the difficulties, and very often those difficulties would be tied in with very real, genuine fears about one's safety due to violence, etc. And so they left, and where would you go? Well, you go to the country that has told you it rules you. You go to the country that has told you must think of us as the mother nation, and so they do. Same with the Afro-Caribbean population who came over in the 1950s from the Caribbean islands in order to populate and to staff many of the newly nationalised industries, such as National Health Service, which provides healthcare for people in Britain, and for the buses and trains, which at that time were nationalised. And so for me growing up, it was very normal to see representatives of all Britain's ex-colonies, people from those nations, in the place that I lived, in my school, in my town, in the facilities I would use. And so, the evidence of British imperial history was right there all the time. And so, Britain has racial problems of its own, but as a kind of multicultural nation, it began on that journey very early on. Now, America's the same, right? However, in America, you obviously have the legacy of slavery, and the legacy of slavery has had an enormous effect on the differential development of people belonging to different demographic groups in the last 150 years. The legacy of slavery in many ways is still with us, not just through the structural inequality that results in the kinds of statistics I gave you, but also in the representation of the races. Now, if you think even after emancipation, after the end of the Civil War, we still have negative stereotypes of African Americans right up through to the late 20th century, through things such as minstrelsy, which is the sort of blackface performances that were very popular throughout the 19th century, and indeed still continued with performers like Al Jolson, very famous 20th century singer of songs like the Swanee River and things like that. Even through the golden age of Hollywood. So blackface has been something that has been tolerated and indeed enjoyed by majority white audiences right up through the 20th century. And these are extremely negative stereotypes, but they persist. Right? And the persistence of the stereotype enables us to, or rather sort of challenges us to try and find the dividing line between, the stereotype and reality. However, this then impinges very much upon the kind of thing we were talking about last week in relation to ideology, right? How easy is it to get out from under this? How much of racism and stereotyping and structural inequality becomes internalized and actually becomes the foundation of the subject and the kind of ideas that the subject builds itself on, right? And to what extent is it possible to kind of extract that from the psyche and find something that's maybe more authentic or sincere? Or is that idea of authenticity itself ultimately illusory, and in fact any kind of subject is built on really kind of shaky foundations? So all these questions wrap in. When the history of the interactions between sort of white Europeans and people from other continents is so long and so brutal and so unjust and so full of this kind of aggregating, snowballing decades and histories of stereotypes and derogatory representations being repeated and repeated and repeated and repeated. I mean, how do we clear that away? How do we get rid of it? And how do we raise consciousness and empower? And as literary critics, obviously, this work is going on and has been going on for decades, really, in many different ways. Obviously, in education, in social justice, in social policy, in law, in sociology, in psychology, in so many different fields. However, as literary critics, we want to look particularly at the way in which narrative and representation plays a role in constructing an idea of the other, right? And as it constructs an idea of the other, how does it similarly construct a kind of concomitant sense of the self? So these are kind of things I want you to think about. These are difficult, ongoing issues, but they're very rewarding if you struggle with them, and they're very interesting in terms of literary criticism and the history of literature and its representation of the other, which very often, the other is there really to inform the self and to put a fence or consolidate a definition of who you are in contradistinction to those savages you are not. right? So, but then again, that too can be problematic. It can be deeply problematic. Two examples that come off the top of my head. Look at Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice, right, in which the other is very clearly the Jew Shylock, but we see at the end of that play in Act 5 that actually the Christians are hypocrites, and the Christians are willing to actually abdicate the rule of law, or negate rather the rule of law, in order to get what they want, which is money. So they're guilty of everything they accuse Shylock of. Or Afroben's Orinoco, which is one of the assignments for this week, and it is a very short novella, a very interesting narrative in which a slave called Caesar as a slave is an ex-Prince Orinoco in his African country of origin near French Guiana, and he occupies these two roles, one in Africa as the hero of a kind of romance narrative, and then one on the plantation as a troublemaking slave. And how do those two versions of otherness interact? Because they seem so incompatible and they run in this sort of parallel fashion. And it's a very interesting and rather complex view of race from the view of a white European woman, which itself has some issues because, of course, as a woman, she doesn't enjoy the same status as the white men on the plantation in this kind of under colonial rule. So, think about the idea of the other as something, in that book as something barbaric, but then the other as something deeply romanticized. And this is Edward Said's idea of Orientalism, the idea of foreigners being incredibly romantic and sensuous, and fragrant. The fragrance of jasmine and I don't know. I couldn't come up with something quick enough then that would have sounded good. So instead, I'm going to abandon this video right now and say enjoy the class, the reading, and I'm looking forward to your assignments, reading your assignments on Saturday. This week, I'm going to try and get your stuff back to you by Wednesday, okay? So look out for your grades on Wednesday, and have a wonderful week.